Good afternoon. The focus of the lecture this afternoon will be upon the Jim Crow era. In terms, if you want a person who wants a time period, we're talking about basically from 1877 till the Civil Rights Movement, and I would say 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was signed by President Lyndon Johnson. There are two types of segregation. One is called de facto, and the other one is called de jure. De facto segregation, which is DEFACTO, exists now, and de facto segregation will always exist. De facto segregation is uh, certain people decide to, black people decide to live in black neighborhoods, whites decide to live in whites neighborhoods, rich decide to live in rich neighborhoods. To a degree, poor decide to live in poor neighborhoods. Asians decide to live in neighborhoods dominated by Asians. In other words, that person makes a decision based upon tradition or history to separate themselves from another group of people. That is de facto segregation. It's based upon choice. What we're talking about, what will occur in the Jim Crow era, is de jure segregation. De jure will be DEJURE. De jure means segregation based upon law. So what will happen in the Jim Crow era will be segregation or separation of blacks and whites based upon laws that will come into existence. Now, the Jim Crow laws then will be a collection of state and local statutes that will legalize racial segregation. They will be named after a black minstrel show character, and the laws were meant to marginalize African Americans by denying them the right to vote, to hold jobs, to get an education, or other opportunities. And for those who attempted to defy Jim Crow laws, often they will face arrests, fines, jail sentences, violence, and death. In actuality, you could say the Jim Crow laws really began during Reconstruction, right after the end of the Civil War, as the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. But what many of the southern states of the former Confederate states will do is they will come up with strict local and state laws that will detail when, where, and how the formerly enslaved African Americans could work and how much they would receive for compensation. I think I told you in a future past lecture what they really did is they would go through the laws and take out the word slave and insert the word black or Negro. Um, this was in what, as I've said to you before, remember, this is a nation of law, and law does not mean that you will have justice. So when we talk about the Jim Crow era, we're talking about laws that will be set up to determine what African Americans could and could not do. Okay? Well, before we talk about some of the laws, let's talk about how they will be enforced. And one of the ways that these Jim Crow laws will be enforced will be used through the use of violence. One of the organizations that will be very violent towards African Americans will be the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee. And it was supposed to be just a private club for Confederate veterans, but it will grow into a secret society that will terrorize black communities throughout the South. And what some people don't know, the Klan will be strong in the North. In the 1920s, the state of Indiana had a government, in particular, a governor who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So do not see the Jim Crow laws as just being Southern. Do not see the Ku Klux Klan as being only a Southern organization. Okay? And what you will see is that uh, in terms of besides the Klan, there will be what will be used also to control African Americans will be lynching. And lynching will be where people will take the law into their own hands. If you want to call it vigilante justice. I would ask you to go watch the series Rise which is sponsored by Simmons College, the Black History Month series that I've talked about before, and especially do some research about Ida B. Wells, because he was one of the primary anti-lynching advocates in this nation. A lynching would be that African American, normally male, was accused of doing something. Sometimes it would be stealing. It might be that they were accused of not working. They might have been accused of not respecting a white person. They might be accused of not getting off the sidewalk. And quite frequently, they would be accused of raping or making a sexual pass at a white female. And those would be grounds for whites to break people out of jail, to go to neighborhoods, whatever they felt was necessary to get this black person, to take them out and to kill them. And I'll just be honest in terms of the brutality. And there are cases on record where we know not only would the African American be hung, but we're also talking about the person's body would be burned, that the person's body would be desecrated. In other words, they would cut off certain parts of the body. Uh, and at the end, sometimes the whites would try and collect body parts, and those body parts would be souvenirs. Uh, so if you just think I'm kidding about this, do some research. Do some research about lynching in this country, uh, and what happened. And not only lynching, there will be race riots. And I know people focus upon the violence that happened with the Black Lives Matter movement throughout this country, but the overwhelming majority still of race riots that have occurred in this country have been whites inflicting violence upon African Americans. And I'm just saying that violence will be used to enforce the Jim Crow laws. And because remember, in court, African Americans could not testify against whites many places, and if they did testify against whites, the whites would not believe them because the jury would be all white and the judges would be all white. Remember, think about Emmett Till, and I know in the 1950s, but that's still a part of the Jim Crow era. That was reality. So also when we talk about the Jim Crow era, we got to talk about the legal needs. The law. How did the law impact this? And one of the ways that it impacted would be the civil rights cases of 1883. The civil rights cases of 1883 will be a decision by the Supreme Court of the United States. And in this case, it will deal with the Civil Rights Act of 1875 and whether it was constitutional or not. The Supreme Court is going to say, yes, it's constitutional, but but the Civil Rights Act only controlled the actions of a state, not an individual. So a simpler way of saying it is in the civil rights cases of 1883, the Supreme Court of the United States will say that a state could not discriminate, but an individual could. And what does that mean? That means the state could not could not say that African Americans and white Americans could not go to the same restaurant. They could not stay in the same hotel. Okay? Okay. The state couldn't be any state laws to treat African Americans differently than white Americans. However, however, when it comes to uh, individual, the individual owner of a hotel could decide who they wanted to allow to stay in that hotel. The individual owner of a restaurant could decide who he or she wanted to serve. So the individual could discriminate, but the state could not do that. Of course, the major decision of the Supreme Court is going to be in 1896, and that involves Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy was an African American who was biracial, very light skinned, but was considered by the law of Louisiana to be an African American. As I can remember, Louisiana was one of the states that had a law that if you had a drop of black blood, you were black. So even though from everything I heard, Plessy looked white, he was considered to be African American, Negro, whatever the dominant term was at that time. And it involved streetcars. Many of the transit system at that time would be streetcars. And what the transit system had done in New Orleans, it would charge African Americans the same price as white Americans, but the African Americans were supposed to get on the front of the streetcar and go to the back of the streetcar. In other words, you got on, you paid, you got off, and you went to the back. And Plessy did not feel that that was right. And what the Supreme Court is going to rule is that separate but equal was constitution. In other words, if there were facilities that were for blacks and facilities for whites, if they were separate, it was okay as long as they were equal. Now, of course, what's going to happen over the Jim Crow era is that the facilities are not going to be equal. But what the Supreme Court ruled is that separate was equal. And so that will mean separate schools will be legal, separate water fountains will be legal, uh, separate, some states will require separate textbooks for black and white students. New Orleans, for example, mandated the segregation of prostitutes according to race. In Atlanta, African Americans in court were given a different Bible from white people to swear on. Marriage and cohabitation between white and black people was strictly forbidden in most other states. Of course, let's be honest, the limit was placed upon black men being with white women. It, there might be a law, might have been a law against the other, but there's no doubt that white men took advantage of black women. So, and it was not uncommon to see signs posted at city limits warning black people that they were not welcome there. And this will definitely be true in northern states, as I said before, Ohio and Indiana, that they had laws. These cities were considered sundown cities. A sundown city was a city or a town where an African American knew that when the sun went down, they were not supposed to be there, and if they were there, they were there risking their lives. So then you have to understand then with the Jim Crow era, the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court, will say that if the facilities were equal, it was okay for them to be separate. So when we go back to my point earlier about segregation, about laws in particular, you can have law, but not have justice. King talked about just laws and unjust laws. And the Jim Crow era will be unjust laws. So blacks and whites could not go to the same schools because it was mandated by law. It was not the choice. Now, so what I'm saying is such as majority the student body of Simmons is black by choice. That is legal. But the Supreme Court was going to say, and will say in the Plessis versus Ferguson, it was the school was a black school, not by choice, but because it had to be. If it was going to be for black students, then that was all that could attend it. And normally, only people who would teach there would be black. In the state of Kentucky, there was something called the Day Law. The Day Law went into effect in 1904 in the state of Kentucky. And in the state of Kentucky, it mainly applied to my alma mater and where I taught before I came here, which was Berea College. Berea College was the first educational institution in the South to be co-education, which is men and women together, and interracial, black and white together. And the state of Kentucky will pass a law in 1904 called the Day Law that will make it illegal for blacks and whites to go to school together. And that will stay on the books until 1950, until the Day Law was amended. And I want to say Bellarmine in Louisville will be the first college and university in Kentucky, in Kentucky, that will allow black and white students to be educated together. Um, Now, besides the civil rights cases of 1883, besides Plessy versus Ferguson, let's talk about the issue of voting. When it comes to the issue of voting, as I stated, by the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, African American males could legally vote. But each state has the right to set its own requirements for people to be able to vote. That's the reason there's such a big controversy, partly with the election of 2020, is that some states will allow, uh, will expand absentee voting. Some states will set up extra hours for people to vote. So everyone has to be 18, everyone has to be a resident of a certain city, of a locality. There are some other things, for example, whether or not you're an ex-felon. Some states, if ex-felon can vote, and other states they cannot. So, voting is a right that every citizen has. However, however, the state gets to decide what are the qualifications in order to be able to vote. So, for example, these are some of the things that the South will set up to make it very difficult for African Americans to vote. The first one eventually was ruled unconstitutional, and that was the grandfather clause. And the grandfather clause was that if you were eligible, if your grandfather was eligible to vote in 1860, then you were eligible to vote. And the courts was decided, well, no, that was definitely discriminatory. Okay, so because that was discriminatory, so that was ruled unconstitutional. A second thing that was set up in order for people to be able to vote in was called the good neighbor requirement. And the good neighbor requirement was African Americans had to get a recommendation from someone white. In other words, someone had to vouch for them that they were a good person. So and they were a good neighbor. So I would think you probably can think of some people, some African Americans you know, that based upon this, they would never have been able to vote. So my point is that someone white would have to vouch for them. Another way that they limited African Americans in terms of voting was called the poll tax. And you should know that the poll tax was finally made unconstitutional. I think it was 1965 and 1966. Check the United States Constitution. The poll tax was where you had to pay a tax to vote. Now, all of you think about it now. When you went to vote in the last election, you did not pay any taxes. Okay, at when the during this time period, the Jim Crow era, you would have to pay taxes. And let's say you were 18, and when you first that was the age to become eligible to vote, and you didn't decide to want to vote again till you were 60. Most states had a law that you would have to pay all your back taxes in order to be able to vote. Well, think about the economic status of many African Americans. They had to make a decision whether they were going to put their money on food and shelter or would they put it on voting. They decided food and shelter. So the poll tax then was worked against, you could say, poor people because for a while, 10.5 years, I lived in Virginia. And Virginia historically was one of those states that had restrictions on who could vote. And they also applied them to poor whites. So I was thinking about the poll tax then was something that could keep poor whites from voting just as much as it would keep black people from voting. But the legal, but as I stated, the poll tax is now unconstitutional because of an amendment to the Constitution. Um, Something else that was used to limit African Americans or to keep African Americans from voting is the literacy test. And I talked about this in class. And I want you to be able to take one of the actual literacy tests. And the literacy test would be that if you went to the office to register to vote, this would be the county clerk or maybe the registrar. I'm not sure what it would have been called in a particular locality, but in Kentucky right now it would be the county clerk's office. You would go and you would want to vote. Well, they would say you'd have to take a test. Okay, and the test that I'm going to give you, they would say is a test that anybody with a fifth grade education should be able to pass. So they could say, "Wow, you don't read on the fifth grade educational level, you don't vote." Or they could say, "Here, here's the P. Here, I want you to read some of the Constitution of the United States, and I want you to interpret it. I want you to read the Constitution of Kentucky, a certain segment. I want you to interpret it. I'm gonna let you read something about Robert's Rules of Order. I want you to interpret it." And what you got to keep in mind, the interpretation, there was only one interpretation was right, and that was the person who was administering the test. So if they said the interpretation was wrong, then that person didn't get the right to vote. Let's say that they asked you to read something, and, and then they asked you to read it, and they asked you to give your interpretation or your assessment of it. Once again, if that clerk decides that the interpretation is wrong, that person didn't vote. So what you will have then is a lot of African Americans who will be college graduates of HBCUs, what we would call HBCUs, or African Americans who have graduated from northern institutions that will not be able to vote because a registrar had decided that they had given the wrong interpretation to a particular literacy requirement. Um, and I'm saying that all of these things together, for many African Americans, they're just going to give up. They're just going to give up because then let's go back, you had the poll tax, you had the good neighbor requirement, you had the literacy requirement. There's always a possibility of violence occurring. And what I mean by violence is the Klan. People may say the Klan, but if you go look at these old pictures of the lynchings that occurred in America, it wasn't just the Klan. It wasn't just the Klan. It was not some, like we like to think in our society, some poor white person that was doing this. This was all of white society. The race riots that will occur. I know that will be one in Corbin, Kentucky in 1919. There will be one in Knoxville. There will be a race riot in Chicago. And Chicago will be because an African American had gotten into, they were at a beach, and an African American had gone into the section of a beach, the beach that was reserved for whites. That led to a race riot. So many African Americans are just going to decide that it was not worth it to try to vote. So we're not talking about, at this point, we're not talking about black women. We're talking about black men. So many portions of the South, especially, are what we call the black belt. If you go to the South, you can tell the black belt. The population becomes predominantly black. Quite often, it is agriculture, a cash crop. It may be cotton, it may be tobacco. The land is flat. The majority of the population will be black, but the people in the political offices, the people who own the businesses, they will be white. Okay, and I'm saying that for any African American, they basically came to the conclusion that they weren't going to be successful if they wanted to vote. So yes, African American men had the right to vote, but the law under the Jim Crow era made it very difficult for them to be able to vote. Um, and I'm trying to make sure that you understand how difficult it was. Some of you may have seen the movie The Green Book. The Green Book was about the Black Traveler's Guide to Jim Crow America, which basically was a book that African Americans would know about that made it clear where the restaurants were that they could stop and be treated as a human being. It made it clear as to where the hotels they could stop and be treated as a human being. Uh, I know some of you now when you travel, you go to the rest areas or you go to Arby's and you go to McDonald's and you don't think anything about it. But an African American traveling during the Jim Crow era had to think about it. Because let's say they stopped to get food. Sometimes that restaurant would serve black people, but the black person would have to go to the back of the restaurant and to get their food, and but they could not sit down to eat it. So another thing that I think is a part of the Jim Crow era that I have not mentioned, and I know I have people who have taken or in sociology classes, you know what a more is, M-O-R-E, more. It's like a custom. It's like a tradition. It's an unwritten thing. Uh, in the Jim Crow era, one of the unwritten laws that everybody knew that African American did not sit down to eat with a white American. They did not sit at the same table. Or an African American would, if they did eat, share the same food, the white American would get to eat it first. And the black American would have to wait. Another one, for example, I always remember my mother on Saturdays morning, she would go to Maryville, Tennessee, and she would go to the stores and buy her dresses for church. Well, if she tried on a dress, she had bought the dress because one of the policies was that anything that African American tried on, a white American would not want to buy. In some places, they enforced the rule that if African American and a white American were approaching each other on the sidewalk, that an African American was supposed to get off the sidewalk and let the white American uh, walk by. And then the African American did not get back on the sidewalk until the white American went by them. African Americans were never called Mr. or Mrs. They would always have some type of derogatory name. They would be boy or auntie. And that African Americans always had to put a title on the name of whites. And if that did not occur, that would be grounds for that person to African American to be lynched. Uh, if you ever get a chance, please go to Montgomery, Alabama, and go to what is called the Lynching Museum. It's not That's not its official name, but Lynching Museum, or sometimes it might be called the Lynching Memorial. But you need to go through there uh, and do some research about it, and you will see all of these lynchings are documented, and the reasons for why African Americans were documented and killed uh, will are listed there. And some of the things that I've just talked about, you would say trivial, would be grounds for an African American to lose his or her life. Let's say a white American decided that an African American was being rude to them. Back once again to uh, if they're being rude to them, that would be grounds for that white American, if they wanted to to inflict physical violence upon them. So understand then, with the Jim Crow era, the laws were reinforced by um, the actions. The legal system was against African Americans. All right, the legal system was it. The extra legal system was against African Americans. Politicians, Now, for example, in Ohio, there was a politician who ran for governor. He promised to bar black citizens from voting. And after he narrowly lost the election, guess what? He was appointed to the United States Senate. And of course, in the Senate, he fought against Reconstruction or any laws that would allow the desegregation of the integration of African Americans and white Americans. So I wanted to stop there, stop here. And so this is where I'm trying to set up. The question for you now is, how should an African American have responded during the Jim Crow era? There will be the way of Booker T. Washington, which is in the Atlanta Compromise. Basically, he talks about the relationship between blacks and whites being like the relationship between the fingers and the hands, which is they could be separate, they could work together. And it's like Booker T. Washington was saying to African Americans, accept the status quo and things will be better by and by. Or there's W.B. Du Bois, and W.B. Du Bois will talk about basically, he would say integration. I wouldn't use that word, but integration. And he would want to go through the court system to fight to get for African Americans not only to have rights, but be able to use those rights. And he was be one of the founders of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is the oldest civil rights organization, which is still in existence. Or there's a third one we don't talk about a lot, and that would be Marcus Garvey. You might remember I joked in class with Miss Thomas that I think Miss Thomas would be the one person in the class who would join Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey just concluded, blacks and whites cannot live together. He also talked about blacks. He will be the one to talk about black liberation. He will come up with the black and the red and the green, and he will be the one that will say it's time for African Americans to go. He would say go back or return. I wouldn't say go back because African Americans are citizens, but he would say African Americans should return to the motherland of Africa. So, three different strategies. How should African Americans have responded? That's what you need to think about. So, hopefully, you have a better idea about the Jim Crow era. If you're anybody who I know, I'm the oldest in the classroom. I grew up. I was born in the Jim Crow era. I remember the civil rights movement and the struggles to end the Jim Crow laws. Fortunately for me, where I lived, was the laws were not as restricted as in other parts of the South. But you could even make an argument that in Louisville, you can still see the remnants of the Jim Crow era based upon where people live. And that is in Louisville with redlining for a long period of time. There were certain sections of Louisville or Jefferson County that were reserved for whites, certain sections that were reserved for African Americans. And you'll see now, even though there may not be any laws in the books, that's when de facto segregation kicks in, and where people live is based upon traditions, based upon history, and many different other factors. Some would even say religion. Remember, you could probably pick out the sections of Jefferson County where people who are Jewish live. Okay, so they work hand in hand together. So some of the de facto segregation we have now is an outgrowth of the de jure segregation that existed in the Jim Crow era. So I hopefully you learned something from this, and maybe you'll be motivated to do a little bit more research. But I want you to think about who had the best strategy for African Americans to deal with the Jim Crow era. Take care. Bye.